Hey, friends. We're working our butts off to bring you this content, just for your entertainment. If you like what you see, here's a deal: instead of offering us tea, just hit that subscribe button. It's way easier, totally free, and honestly makes us just as happy. Here is the news story, let's begin. I grew up thinking of myself as a boy in the simplest, most ordinary way. The label was there before I was old enough to argue with it, and the world kept confirming it. How my relatives spoke to me, what clothes were bought for me, the kinds of play that earned approving laughter. I learned early that belonging was partly a performance you did without realizing you were performing. You sat the right way. You chose the right games. You kept your voice from getting too soft when adults were listening. You laughed at jokes you didn't fully understand because the laughter was a kind of passport. But there was always a quieter life underneath that surface, a private set of curiosities and sensations that didn't fit neatly into the boy shape everyone saw. It wasn't a grand rebellion. It wasn't even, at first, a secret I could name. It was more like a pull towards certain textures, certain gestures, certain ways of moving that felt strangely calm, like exhaling after holding my breath. I didn't have words like identity exploration or gender expression. I only had instincts, what I reached for when nobody was watching, what I avoided when I sensed it might bring questions. My earliest memory of clothing crossing those invisible lines wasn't dramatic. It was a day in my childhood bedroom, the kind of day that felt like every other day except for one small decision. My mother was in the kitchen. The house was quiet in the way houses are quiet when adults are busy and you have the illusion of being alone. I was looking for something, maybe a toy, maybe a book, and I opened a drawer that wasn't mine. It was my sister's drawer, or maybe it belonged to my mother, I can't even remember now, but I remember the smell of fabric that didn't smell like my clothes. There was a softness there, and colors that weren't assigned to me. I touched a piece of clothing and the touch alone felt like stepping into a different temperature of air. I didn't put anything on that day. I only held it, then put it back, and my heart beat fast anyway, as if even wanting it was an offense. I was a child, but I already understood rules that had never been formally explained. I understood that some desires were the kind you could laugh about and others were the kind you kept behind your teeth. The first time I actually tried something on came later, old enough to understand shame as a social emotion, not just a personal one. I remember standing in front of the mirror in a hallway where the light was unforgiving. I had borrowed something small, something that could be hidden quickly if I heard footsteps. It didn't transform me into a different person the way movies pretend. It didn't reveal my true self in a single magical instant. It did something quieter and more confusing. It made me feel both more present and more exposed. I looked at myself and saw a version of me that had been inside my head but not outside of it. And the moment after that, I saw how fragile it was, how easily it could be ridiculed, punished, misunderstood. What I didn't realize then was that the most formative moment wouldn't be the moment I chose to crossdress in private. It would be the moment someone else framed me in a role I hadn't agreed to yet, and how that framing rearranged the way I behaved around them afterward. It happened when I was still young enough to have friends who treated life like an experiment, trying on personalities the way you tried on jackets. I had a friend, older by a year, maybe two, who had the kind of confidence that made him seem older than he was. He wasn't cruel, not in the obvious way. He was playful, curious, and he liked pushing boundaries the way some kids like jumping from higher and higher places just to feel the drop. We were at his house, because his parents worked late and his older sister had moved out, which meant there was a kind of freedom there that my house didn't have. There were fewer eyes, fewer routines, fewer unspoken expectations. I don't know why I admitted anything to him. Maybe it was the way he talked, like nothing could embarrass him. Maybe it was the way he asked questions without shame, as if shame was a language he hadn't learned. Or maybe I was just tired of being alone with the secret. He found out not through some dramatic discovery, but through conversation. I said something clumsy, hinted at something, then tried to laugh it off. He didn't laugh it off. He leaned in as if I'd handed him a puzzle piece and he wanted to see the whole picture. My stomach felt like it was shrinking. He asked if I'd ever tried on girls' clothes. I said no too quickly. He smiled the way people smile when they know you're lying and they don't intend to let you keep the lie. He said, "Come on. You're curious. That's not a crime. Even now, I can feel the heat in my face remembering that sentence, curious, not a crime. It was such a simple reframing. He wasn't offering approval exactly, but he was removing the immediate threat of condemnation. And at that age, that felt like oxygen. His house had a closet where some of his sister's old things were still stored in boxes. He said it like it was no big deal. If you want, we can just see. No one's here. There was a moment where I could have said no and stayed in the familiar discomfort of wanting. Instead, I nodded. I nodded like I was agreeing to something ordinary, and my heart hammered like I'd agreed to jump off a roof. We went upstairs, and he pulled out a box with the casual confidence of someone opening a board game. He lifted pieces of clothing like props, not like taboos. This one, he asked, holding up something simple. I shook my head. My mouth was dry. I couldn't pick, because picking felt like admitting preference, and preference felt like confession. He chose for me. That was the first time I felt the strange relief of having someone else decide, relief and fear at the same time. He said, almost teasing, okay, little sister, we'll start easy. I froze. It was like the air changed shape around the words. Little sister. Not a girl, not a slur, not a cruel joke exactly. A role. A place in a family structure. Something that implied familiarity and hierarchy. The phrase landed with a shock that was physical. My first response wasn't excitement or comfort, it was embarrassment so sharp it felt like pain. My throat tightened, and I felt my body go rigid with the instinct to reject it. Don't call me that, I said, but my voice came out quieter than I expected. He raised his eyebrows, not offended, just amused. Why? It fits. You're blushing. That made it worse. Because he was right. I could feel my face burning. The humiliation wasn't about being seen in different clothes. It was about being seen reacting. I wasn't prepared for how exposed I'd feel by my own feelings. The next minutes were clumsy. I stepped into the borrowed clothes like I was stepping into deep water, trying not to show fear. My hands shook a little. He kept talking, filling the air with jokes and instructions, stand there, turn around, okay, relax. He wasn't gentle in the way an adult would be gentle, he was a kid too, playing with power without fully understanding it. But he also wasn't malicious. He didn't threaten me. He didn't make it sexual. He simply treated the situation like something he could direct, and that was enough to shift something in me. Because I realized, standing there, that my shame wasn't only about the clothes. It was about losing control of the narrative. In my private moments, I had control, I could stop, hide, deny. Here, in his house, with his eyes on me, I had less control. And in a strange, confusing way, part of me found that loss of control, not pleasant, exactly, but easing. Like letting someone else hold a heavy box you'd been carrying alone. The weight didn't disappear, but your arms stopped burning. He said, little sister, again, and I felt the same shock, but this time there was something else underneath it, a tiny, unwanted spark of wanting to be included in the game, wanting the role to make sense. Wanting, maybe, to see what happened if I didn't fight it. That was the first hint of playful submission, though I didn't have those words then. It wasn't about humiliation. It wasn't about being made into something. It was about the relief of being guided, the temporary suspension of responsibility for explaining myself. It was the feeling of being told, this is who you are in this room, and you can stop arguing for a moment. I hated that I didn't hate it completely. When he asked me to sit down, I sat. When he told me to fix my posture, I did. I became hyper-aware of my movements, trying to imitate what I thought a little sister would do, because I didn't know any other way to inhabit the role. It was awkward and probably obvious. But the role began to shape my behavior anyway. My voice softened without me choosing it. I started asking permission before moving, not because he demanded it, but because I wanted the next instruction, the next confirmation that the game was continuing and I hadn't ruined it. That is a hard thing to admit, even now, because it sounds like I'm describing something unhealthy. And it could have become unhealthy if it had stayed frozen in that dynamic, if I had learned that my comfort depended on someone else's control, or if he had used that control to hurt me. But the truth is more complicated. That moment wasn't the start of a fetish. It was the start of a question: why does being seen in a different role feel both terrifying and relieving? Why does a simple label from someone else have the power to reorganize my thoughts? After that day, nothing was the same between us, even when we weren't talking about it. I carried the memory like a warm stone in my pocket, heavy, secret, strange. I also carried fear. Not fear that I'd be exposed as if I were committing a crime, but fear that I'd be reduced to that moment, that role, that blush. Kids can be careless with each other's secrets. Even good kids can be careless. I avoided him for a while. I told myself it was because I was busy, but really it was because I didn't know how to be around him as a normal again. When we did see each other, he would sometimes smirk and say something like, "How's my little sister?" in a voice that was half joke, half test. Every time he did it, I felt the same rush, shock, embarrassment, and then the faint, confusing feeling of being pulled into a current. I started to notice something about myself that I hadn't noticed before. My behavior changed around him. I became more agreeable, more cautious, more eager to keep things smooth. I would laugh at his jokes more readily. I'd let him choose what game we played. I'd follow his lead in conversations. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. It was as if that label had created a small gravitational field between us. And then, as life does, it complicated everything. Because outside of that friendship, I was still living in a world that treated anything gender nonconforming as either a joke or a threat. School hallways were full of unspoken rules enforced by laughter. The word "girl" could be used as an insult. The idea of a boy wearing girls' clothes was treated as inherently funny or inherently wrong, sometimes both. So I developed two selves, the public self who tried to be unremarkable, and the private self who kept returning to the same questions. The private self wasn't always brave. Sometimes it was just tired. Sometimes it would rather hide than fight. But it also kept noticing what made me feel calm. Not excited, not thrilled, but calm. Softness. Certain shapes of clothing. The act of preparing myself carefully, like I was taking responsibility for how I appeared. The quiet, deliberate movements I allowed myself only when I was alone. In early adolescence, the pressure to conform intensified. Bodies changed, voices dropped, social hierarchies hardened. The world demanded answers to questions I didn't know how to answer. Are you one of the boys? Are you tough? Are you normal? Every day felt like an exam I hadn't studied for. I also began to understand mental health in the way teenagers often do, through the fog of mood and self-criticism. I didn't have language for anxiety, but I had it. I didn't have language for rumination, but I did it. I would replay interactions in my head, checking for mistakes, checking for signs that someone suspected something about me. I wasn't being hunted. But I felt hunted by possibility. My family wasn't cruel, but they were ordinary in the way that can still be painful. They wanted me to be safe, and they equated safety with fitting in. They made comments about other people, small jokes, casual judgments, that taught me what would happen if I became a topic. I learned that love could exist alongside misunderstanding. That was one of the first adult truths I ever learned. People can care about you deeply and still not know how to make space for who you are. I tried to shut the whole part of me down. I told myself it was a phase, curiosity, something I could outgrow by ignoring it. I threw myself into acceptable hobbies. I tried to deepen my voice on purpose. I copied the posture of boys who seemed secure. For a while, it worked in the way that suppression often works. It made life simpler on the outside, and louder on the inside. The little sister memory didn't disappear. It changed. It became less about that friend and more about the concept of role. It made me wonder if identity was something you discovered alone or something that emerged in relationship. I didn't like the idea that someone else's words could shape me because it felt like weakness. But I couldn't deny the evidence. Being seen differently had changed me. In late adolescence, I had my first real ethical decision about it. Not a dramatic one. A quiet, serious one. I was invited to a party where people would drink, and I knew from experience that drinking loosened tongues and blurred boundaries. I also knew that someone there had a tendency to joke by humiliating people. Part of me wanted to go anyway, because I wanted to be normal. Another part of me felt a cold warning: you're not ready to be careless with your own safety. I chose not to go. That choice felt like weakness in the moment, like I was letting fear dictate my life. But later, when I heard about what happened, someone's private texts read aloud for laughs, someone crying in a bathroom, I felt something else: relief and a strange respect for myself. It was one of the first times I realized that self-acceptance isn't only about proudly declaring who you are. Sometimes it's about quietly protecting the parts of you that are still tender. Around that time, I found information online, not sensational stories, not dramatic before and after it narratives, but ordinary discussions where people talked about gender expression, crossdressing, and identity exploration with nuance. I learned that crossdressing could mean many things. For some it was performance. For some it was comfort. For some it was a path toward realizing they were transgender. For some it was simply clothing, not identity. I learned that there wasn't one correct storyline. That knowledge didn't solve my confusion, but it softened the panic. If there were many possible meanings, then my feelings didn't have to be a verdict. They could be data. I started to treat my own experience more gently, like something worth studying rather than condemning. I also started to notice the difference between secrecy and privacy. Secrecy felt like rot, like I was hiding because I believed I was bad. Privacy felt like boundaries, like I was protecting something personal until I was ready to share it responsibly. In my early adulthood, when I moved away from home, the physical distance created psychological space. I could buy clothes without my family seeing the bags. I could do laundry without explaining whose items were whose. I could exist in my own apartment with the door locked and feel, for the first time, that my life belonged to me in a practical sense. That freedom came with loneliness, though. When you've spent years suppressing something, you don't automatically know how to integrate it. You can end up living in compartments: work self, friend self, alone self. And compartments are safe, but they are also exhausting. The constant switching takes energy you don't realize you're spending. I cross-dressed more often then, not as an event but as a routine, sometimes when I was stressed, sometimes when I was sad, sometimes when I wanted to feel grounded. I learned that what it gave me wasn't an escape from myself, but an encounter with myself. The act of getting ready, choosing an outfit, adjusting things, looking in the mirror, forced me to slow down and pay attention. It was a form of mindfulness I never would have called mindfulness at the time. But even then, I wasn't free from the old shame. I would panic if I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment, even though no one had a key. I would hide things when a repair person came, as if they might open drawers for no reason. Shame makes you imagine surveillance everywhere, and it turns your own home into a stage where you are always one mistake away from humiliation. I also had to confront the question of responsibility. It would have been easy to resent the world for making me hide. But I also had to admit that people around me deserved honesty in appropriate ways. If I was going to date, I couldn't build intimacy on a foundation of omission. If I was going to have close friendships, I couldn't expect others to understand me if I never gave them a chance. The question was not whether to share, but how and when. The first person I told as an adult was not a romantic partner. It was a friend who had shown, over time, that they could hold complexity without turning it into gossip. We were sitting in a car after a late meal, talking about nothing and everything, the way friends do when they trust each other. I said it slowly, clumsily. I expected a reaction that would confirm my fear. Instead, my friend paused and said, "Okay. Thank you for trusting me. What does it mean for you?" That question mattered more than any reassurance. What does it mean for you? Not what does it mean to the world, not what does it mean about your masculinity, not what does it mean about your sexuality. For you. It forced me to take ownership of my story. I didn't have to accept someone else's framing, even a friendly one. I told them about the first time someone called me little sister and how it had shocked me, embarrassed me, and then quietly changed how I behaved. Saying it out loud made me see it more clearly. I had been hungry for permission. Not permission to be harmed, not permission to be controlled, but permission to stop fighting myself for a moment. The playful submission wasn't about being less, it was about being allowed to be softer without punishment. My friend didn't laugh. They nodded and said something like, "That makes sense." Roles can be comforting, especially when you've been carrying something alone. That night, I walked back to my apartment and felt lighter in a way I hadn't felt before. Not because my identity was solved, but because it had been witnessed without being turned into a spectacle. That was a turning point. I began to understand that authenticity isn't a performance for others. It's a relationship with yourself that becomes easier when the right people are allowed into it. There were setbacks. There were days when I hated myself again, when I felt ridiculous, when I wondered if I was building my life around a secret that would eventually poison everything. There were moments when I considered throwing everything away, clothes, makeup, any evidence, just to feel clean. But I had learned by then that purging isn't healing. Purging is panic disguised as decisiveness. Instead, I tried to build healthier coping strategies. When anxiety spiked, I learned to name it instead of obeying it. When shame shouted that I was disgusting, I practiced answering with facts. I'm not harming anyone. I'm not deceiving anyone in a relationship. I'm exploring my identity responsibly and privately. Clothing is not moral failure. I began therapy eventually, not because crossdressing was a problem to be fixed, but because the fear and isolation around it had shaped my mental health for years. Therapy helped me untangle what belonged to me and what belonged to social pressure. I also had to confront the way I had internalized stereotypes. Part of my early crossdressing had been imitation, trying to perform femininity as I imagined it, which often meant copying exaggerated cues from media. Over time, I realized that was another kind of cage. If I was going to respect myself, I had to allow myself to be a person wearing certain clothes, not a caricature trying to earn permission. That shift was subtle but profound. My choices became less about passing and more about comfort and expression. I stopped treating the mirror like a judge and started treating it like a tool. I started to ask, do I feel like myself? Not, do I look like someone else? As I moved deeper into adulthood, the question of integration became unavoidable. It's one thing to have a private practice that comforts you. It's another to build a life where you don't feel split in half. Integration didn't mean telling everyone. It didn't mean making my identity public. It meant reducing the amount of energy spent hiding from myself. I began to set principles. I would not lie if asked directly by someone with a right to know, like a serious partner. I would not use secrecy as a substitute for boundaries. If I needed privacy, I would claim it honestly. I would not accept relationships where ridicule was the price of closeness. I would not confuse someone else's control with my own peace. That last one mattered because of that early little sister moment. I could appreciate the comfort of a role without surrendering my autonomy. I could enjoy playfulness without letting it become dependence. When I eventually entered a serious relationship, I told my partner before commitment deepened. I did it not in a dramatic confession, but in a calm conversation about who I was and what I needed. I expected fear. I expected misunderstanding. What I got was a thoughtful silence, then questions, then a clear statement. I don't fully understand yet, but I want to. And I care about you. That didn't make everything easy. We had to negotiate boundaries, because every relationship requires that, and this was no different. My partner needed reassurance that my identity exploration wasn't a rejection of them. I needed reassurance that I wasn't going to be mocked in vulnerable moments. We learned, slowly, that respect is not just kindness, it's consistency. It's keeping someone's trust safe when you have the power to break it. I also had to revisit my family, not necessarily by telling them everything, but by seeing them as people with limits and histories. My parents had grown up in a world where gender roles were survival strategies. They weren't villains. They were shaped by their own fears. That understanding helped me release some resentment, even while I kept my boundaries. I learned that compassion and distance can coexist. You can love people and still protect yourself from their ignorance. Over time, the story I told myself about that early a little sister moment changed. When I was younger, it felt like a humiliating accident, something that proved I was weak. Later, it felt like a secret treasure, something that proved I had a hidden self. Eventually, it became something more balanced, an early example of how identity can be influenced by context, power, and language. A reminder that the way people name you can shape you, and that you have the right, as you grow, to rename yourself. Because that was the final stage of my integration, claiming authorship. I began to see crossdressing not as a separate life, but as one aspect of a larger human need to explore, to express, to find emotional honesty. For me, it became a practice of self-respect. Not because it made me better, but because it required me to take myself seriously. It forced me to confront shame rather than letting shame run the show. It forced me to build a moral framework that wasn't based on fear. It forced me to practice empathy, because once you know what it feels like to be judged for something harmless, you become more careful about judging others. I also learned to be responsible about where and how I expressed myself. Not every space is safe. Not every person is trustworthy. Self-acceptance doesn't require recklessness. It requires discernment. I learned to choose communities, sometimes online, sometimes in person, where respect was the baseline. I learned to avoid spaces that turned identity exploration into spectacle, because spectacle erases nuance and invites cruelty. I learned to speak about it in ways that were honest without being provocative, because I didn't want my story to become fuel for someone else's stereotypes. And I learned something that surprised me: the more I respected myself, the less I needed the little sister framing to feel allowed. I could still remember the shock and embarrassment and the strange pull of it. I could still understand why it affected my behavior and mindset back then. But I no longer needed someone else to assign me a role in order to feel permission. I could be gentle without being instructed to be gentle. I could be soft without being made smaller. I could play without losing myself. That doesn't mean the conflict vanished forever. Identity exploration is not a one-time puzzle you solve and never revisit. Life changes. Stress returns. Social pressure shows up in new forms. Sometimes an offhand joke in a workplace can still tighten my chest. Sometimes a news story about someone being attacked for gender nonconformity can flood me with fear. Sometimes I still have to remind myself, my existence is not an argument. My choices do not need to be justified to people who refuse to understand. But I have a steadier center now. My center is built from years of small, responsible decisions, choosing safety over proving something, choosing honesty over compartmentalization, choosing therapy over self-punishment, choosing relationships that honor me, choosing empathy over bitterness. Those decisions don't make my story perfect. They make it real. If you're listening to this, and you recognize any piece of it, maybe the private curiosity, the fear of being framed by someone else, the confusion of feeling both embarrassed and relieved, the way a role can change your behavior before you even agree to it, I want you to know something simple and grounded. You're not broken for having questions. You're not immoral for seeking comfort. What matters is how you treat yourself and others while you figure things out. Move slowly. Be honest where honesty is owed. Protect your mental health. Don't let shame force you into isolation. And don't let anyone else's labeling, whether cruel or playful, become the final authority on who you are. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.